Hey, I'm Caleb with YouCanMakeThisToo, and I need to rebuild my jointer. There's information in the description about the Patreon contest prize this month, and while I get you caught up to speed on the jointer, watch me work on this jig that I need to push the bushings into the bearings. After I threw the blade and decided it was time to change the cutter head, I foolishly got impatient and dismantled everything without filming it so I could get the parts ordered. Fortunately, it turned out that a generic Shelix head would work with the dimensions of my jointer. Kind of. The trick was I couldn't find bearings that fit the bearing housings of my jointer and the shaft size of the new head. Fortunately, the new shafts had a smaller diameter than the old cutter head, so I was able to order some custom bushings from McMaster Carr to reuse the old bearings after repacking them. There was probably a better way to do all this, but this isn't my area of expertise. I wasn't able to get the bushing into the bearings, so my first thought was to build a jig so I could use my small floor jack. I mistakenly thought that the few tons of force it provides would be enough to get these bushings in, but it wasn't. I also think this might have something to do with my jack failing the next time I used it when I tried to level out my new camper I'm restoring. Okay, so I tried this threaded rod setup. I've got these blocks to distribute the force right. As you can see, I've got some washers in there, so that way I'm not just digging into the wood, but all I'm really doing is deforming the metal. I was using socket wrenches with breaker bars to get the hit a failure point. But then I remembered when things don't like to go together, often impact is more effective than just increasing the force. All right, so I finally got the first bushing in. I had a lot of comments on Instagram. I was doing some updates there, and quite a few people told me it's better to freeze the bushing and heat the bearing so that way the bushing contracts and the bearing expands a little bit. That gives you a little bit more play. And also put paste wax in there that'll help everything go better. So I'm gonna try to use those tips along with the jig that worked on this, and hopefully it goes a little smoother. I also got smarter and used a screw clamp to hold everything in an easier position. Now to get the bearing bushing combos onto the cutter head. I just hammered them on using an offcut to protect the shaft. I also had a washer underneath everything that was sized to fit on the bushing but not touch the bearing races to prevent damage to the bearing while I pound on this. I did the short side bearing first and then set the head in place to see how far I needed to seat the other bearing bushing set. And once again, I got a pound town with my shaft, again using the washer underneath to make sure that the forces are only on the shaft and the bushing, not the bearing. Lubing my shaft first might have made this a little easier, but I want to make sure it doesn't come off once I get it in there. I'm only able to get the bearing so far that way though, so then I switched to an offcut with a hole drilled in it that matches the size of my shaft so I can seat the bushing all the way down. I only destroyed about 3 blocks in this process of getting it seated. Once both bearings are properly seated, I can drop the cutter head back into place and close the bearing blocks. When I took them apart, they seem to have some sort of liquid gasket seal on them. I don't know if that's necessary, but because it was there before, I added some more Smurf spit before putting it back together. Now for the part I've been dreading, which is trying to get everything coplanar. My old cutter head was slightly out of alignment, but I made up for that with how I set the blade, so everything was fine. But as it is right now, this side of the cutter head is a little low by about 15 thousandths, or on the table, this side of the table is high by 15 thousandths. So I need to adjust this bed to get everything flat, and then I can get the in-feed table coplanar with the out-feed. And yeah, let's get to it. The first step to adjusting everything is getting the beds slid back into place. I had to slide them out to remove the old cutter head, but between taking everything apart and putting it back together, I had a hernia repair, so when the beds didn't slide back easily, I decided it was a better idea to clean and lube the ways instead of re-injuring myself. To get everything aligned, I'm going to use this big straight edge that I got off Amazon. And one of the tricks with my old jointer though is this bed is not totally flat. The back end kind of dips some, so depending on where I have it, it's actually resting on that dip, and so it's got some bounce. So I've got to make sure that I always slide it far enough that it's referencing off the flat area that I want it to reference off of. So up here, it's good. And then to adjust it, it rides on these ways, which is just an angle. And when you crank the handle, it goes up and down it. On the back side of this, there are 2 bolts that hold it in place. So what I'm gonna do is loosen those bolts. Then I can slide this, each one of these as I need to make each corner of the table go up and down. So to get the back of the table lined up with this cutter head the same as the front is, I've got this set to, I was peeking and I spun the cutter head till I saw the smallest gap, and now I'm gonna adjust those ways until this just barely kisses. Okay, after lots of back and forth, I got pretty close and I broke up my feeler gauge, and I used my feeler gauges to get this set, and they're both probably within 1,000th or 2 of each other. I used my 10, 12, and 13 thousandths feeler gauges, so the idea was the 10 should definitely go in. I wanted the 12 to feel like it was rubbing on both sides, and the 13 to not fit, and that's how it fits on both of them. Probably not good enough for a machinist, but for a woodworker, good for me. The 1.5 horsepower direct drive motor that was on this machine was underpowered for the original cutter head, so I knew I would really be pushing my luck to try and drive the new cutter head with it. So while I was at it, I decided to replace the motor with a new 3 horsepower motor and switched from the direct drive to a dual belt setup. That'll be easier on the motor, but that meant I needed a new motor mount, so that's what I've been whipping together here. Easily my best idea during this whole process was using this piece of cardboard and some spray paint to create a template for the holes that I needed to drill for the hinges. Fortunately, cast iron drills out pretty easy because it's actually soft as far as metals go, but I still slowly stepped up through several bits to minimize the chance of any issues. Got everything tightened, and off camera I wired it up in accordance with the wiring diagram, made sure and to get the rotation going the way I think it's supposed to, and went ahead and painted this black. I think it looks a lot better. Now, see if I did everything right, and as you can tell, I'm gonna test this before I have it all hooked up, so that way if something's wrong, it's not spinning a giant cutter head. That's awesome. Let's make sure it's spinning the right way. I need my cutter head to go towards me, so this needs to be going the same way too. There we go. Yep, it's going the right way. Now we can attach the cutter head. So I think this is meant to go on this way, and I was planning on cutting this off, the extra, but then I realized I can just turn it around, and because I can turn around, I'm not going to cut off this extra because I don't know if this is hardened or anything. In cutting it, I don't want to ruin any heat treat or anything like that I might have, or tempering, and it really doesn't hurt to be there. So I've got my piece of tea stock, and I'm just going to slip it on and beat it on. Now, ideally, the shaft coming from my cutter head would be longer. It is under at least the first belt, and it's getting into the second. I think that's going to be enough to hold it, especially once I finish getting this seated. Like I said, longer would be ideal, but that would have easily driven the cost of this head up 2 or 3 times to have it custom made versus using the generic one. We're ready for the test run. Got my safety stick. It worked. Took a second to get up to speed. I think that might have been just the belts, getting seated into place. So yeah, we'll get the fence on, try it again. To stop rusting and lubricate the top, I'm giving Byrd T9 a try. I know some folks swear by it, and Byrd was kind enough to send some out for me to try. With everything seeming to work and the bed treated, I put the fence back on and give this thing a try. All right, for the inaugural cut, we got a nice piece of cherry here. Has a little bit of a cup, a little bit of a bow. Let's see how it goes. Okay, here's the first pass, and first impressions are wow. it cuts so much easier and smoother, like there's zero resistance, and it's way quieter. Used to, you could really hear it whenever I started to cut, and this is like butter smooth too. Like that doesn't even need to go through a planer. Geez, well, I mean you do for dimensioning, but wow, that's amazing. I've clearly put a lot of use on the joiner since I finished the project. I know a lot of people be wondering how I threw a blade, and I've also been meaning to paint this badge, so I figured I'd knock both of those things out. Short version is, I was jointing and I threw a blade. The longer version is my blades were dull, so I thought I'd be a responsible woodworker and replace them. So I ordered some new blades and replaced them. In the process of replacing them, I discovered that the previous owner had actually put planer knives on them. They were too small. So I took them out and put the new blades in, ran it for a bit, and getting those new blades like set up right with the table was a super duper pain. But I finally got them close and used it some, tightened all the nuts. Everything was good because they can work loose a little bit. And figured it was all good. Then a few days later, I was jointing a board, face jointing it, and all of a sudden I noticed on the edge where I was passing it along, there was a gap between the blade and the board instead of it being flat. And I thought to myself, did this board have some wane? Was that there before or not? And in the time it took me to have that thought, well, boom, the blade through. So I jumped back, kicked the off switch, let it power down. Fortunately, everything was contained, so there was no injury. But the moral of the story, big reasons there were no injuries was I had my fence set. I know a lot of people like to get onto me for not using push blocks. I did buy some push blocks. I have some push blocks now. But whenever I do any face jointing, I'm really intentional about setting my fence to make sure that the blades are completely covered. So the blades were entirely covered when it happened, which helped contain all the shrapnel, and it could only go down. My son was actually in the shop with me that day, and anytime I run any big machines, I tell him to stand on the other side of the shop and definitely make sure he's out of the path of if anything goes wrong, where debris may fly. So he was well out of the way. And those two things definitely help prevent any potential injuries. So make sure you have a safety plan for stuff and that you follow it.